The Central Board of the Reserve Bank of India meets in Mumbai today for a much anticipated meeting. RBI watchers will tell you that RBI board meets are typically fairly routine, uneventful affairs. Well, not this time around. Almost everyone is watching to see what the outcome is, and even if the outcome is not direct, what actually transpired at this board meeting. Let me just first give you a sense of what is on the agenda today. Firstly, it's important to remember that this is a continuation of the previous board meet which took place in October. Now, that board meeting was inconclusive on a large number of issues, and since that board meeting, all the differences between the RBI and the government are out in public domain. Viralacharya's now legendary central bank independence speech has thrown open the doors to all the disputes that are perhaps happening behind closed doors between the RBI and the government. So the board will sit down again and try and conclude that unfinished agenda. But it's not just about the agenda now. It is about the issues which we'll talk about, but also the form of the discussion, which is going to be important to focus on at the end of today's board meet. So let's take a look at the issues first. There are a whole host of issues. We've tried to put them into three buckets. The red bucket, where the RBI should not be giving in. The yellow bucket, where the RBI perhaps can do some give and take. And the green bucket, where the RBI actually should be doing something to ease their own regulations. Let me start with this set of issues. Transfer of the contingency reserves. I think there's been a lot of focus on the RBI's balance sheet. Within the balance sheet, there's the revaluation reserves, which now, through various writings, people have pointed out, cannot be transferred to the government because these are unrealized gains. It's the contingency reserves of about 2.5 lakh crore where all eyes are focused. Now, can past accretions to this reserve be transferred to the government? That is one point of contention. The RBI will fight very hard to prevent anything like that, particularly if it's coming from the perspective of filling a fiscal hole. As Indira Rajaraman, a noted economist, told us, it would be an appalling precedent to set to actually dip into the RBI's reserves to try and fill a fiscal hole. So this is something that the RBI will rightfully dig its heels on. But if the contingency reserves that have been accumulated are not touched, then perhaps there will be a discussion on a new economic capital framework which would determine future transfers to these contingency reserves. Now, here the RBI has been very sort of tight-lipped on what framework they follow, and maybe there'll be a little bit of discussion about setting up a committee, re-looking at this framework and having an agreement between the government and the Reserve Bank of India. That's not something that the RBI should fight hard against. They should be willing to explain where they come from in terms of their requirements for various reserve categories in their balance sheet, and the government probably be justified in putting across a view as well. The payment regulator, well, this is not an immediate issue of discussion, but again, if it were to come to that, this is an issue that the RBI would not want to give in on. They would not want the payment regulator to be outside their purview, but this is not something that is being immediately debated. So let's move on to the second category. This is the Basel norms, the prompt corrective action, and the February 12th circular. Start with the bottom. The February 12th circular, is in a court now. So it's unlikely that the RBI will do anything on this just yet. The Supreme Court is due to hear it at the end of the month to see whether power companies are kept within the ambit of this or not. But nevertheless, the government is still fighting for some sort of easing up of that circular. Prompt corrective action seems to have become a big contentious point. Important to remember that the government actually supported this when it was announced in April 2017, but it now feels that it's restraining flow of credit into the economy, and it wants this framework to be loosened up so that at least a couple of the large banks come out of it. We on BloombergQuint had recently done an analysis of the position of these banks. They still remain weak. They're reporting large losses, but their provision coverage ratios have improved, and a couple of banks are near that lower threshold of about 6% of net NPA. So maybe the RBI can do something to take one or two banks out of it by pushing up that threshold of net NPA beyond which banks get put into prompt corrective action. But they would want to persist with the broader framework. Then there's the Basel norms. Now, the Basel norms in India are stricter than the global norms. There's no fighting that, but they have been that way. That framework has been in public domain since 2013, 2014. So it's not clear why the government is fighting for these norms to be eased. The total capital requirement is 9%. With capital conservation buffer, you go above 11.5% or close to 11.5%. Maybe there could be some give and take or an extension of the timeline, because the timeline of implementation ends in 2019. Maybe the best the RBI can do there is stretch out the timeline a little bit and give some relief to the government, which has to put capital into these banks. On the last two issues, this is where the RBI can and perhaps should be doing more. I think the belief is that the NBFC crisis is not over. The market attention has been focused on listed NBFCs, large NBFCs, but it doesn't appear that that's where the problem lies. The problem may lie in the smaller NBFCs that are servicing small and medium enterprises. And a lot of people do believe that the RBI needs to do more to either make system liquidity more comfortable, which continues to be in deficit, or find a way to have liquidity flowing more smoothly from banks to NBFCs. So, this is something that the RBI should be willing to consider. It may not come at the end of today's board meet, but it should be something they should take on board. And the other is the easing of the SME strains. For one reason or another, you can blame the government for it if you want, but between demonetization, GST, and now this NBFC crisis, the country's small and medium enterprises have taken it on the chin. So is there anything they can do to ease their pain? Let me remind you that the RBI had already given a special dispensation of 60 days additional overdue before these accounts are classified as NPA. That 60-day got extended into 90 days. So a 180-day period had been given to NBFCs. That 180-day period ended in September. So should the RBI do something more? Should some sort of forbearance be brought in? The RBI may not want to make that step very obvious because it would lead to some sort of moral hazard, but something on the SME side perhaps needs to be considered. Those are the issues of discussion. Then there is the form of discussion, which I mentioned at the start. Section 7, enough has been said about it, but it does look like the government at least threatened the use of Section 7. Do they back away from that? If they do give a directive under Section 7, I think it wouldn't be outside the realm of probability that the RBI governor would not want to stay on in a scenario like this. And as many experts have said, that would be extremely catastrophic to have an RBI governor step down on something like that. But even if Section 7 does not come into play, you want to see what is the nature of discussion between the board and the governor and the executive of the RBI actually. Is the board forcing a resolution? Is the board interfering a lot more than it has been in the past? Now, the board has a lot of powers under the RBI Act, but by tradition, those powers have not really been used. We've spoken to a number of board members, all of whom say that by tradition, the board has been an advisory body. Is that nature of the central board changing? That will be important to keep in mind as well, because if that change in relationship between the board and the RBI executive is starting to take place, then the next step is to be a lot more careful about who you're appointing on the board. So a lot of issues at play. No clarity on whether any of this would get resolved by end of day, as some people are expecting, but nevertheless, intense scrutiny.